I am delighted to be here and to be with the National Economist Club for your program. I was delighted to see your upcoming program with my old friend and colleague from the other side of the aisle, Bill Frenzel, speaking in about 2 weeks, and hopefully he will have some good news on the budget. One of the things that I found out about budget policy is that you can leave Washington and come back, and 10 years later and pick right up where you left off. The speeches are the same, the issues are the same, so you haven't missed a thing by leaving town. But it is good to be back. I'm also, since Ed reminded that this is going to be replayed at 9:30 Sunday morning on C-SPAN, probably I should say at this time that this will not suffice for church services, that we need to go ahead and either turn into Oral Roberts, one of my former constituents, tune into him, or go on to church or have your religious services, because this will not count for that. I just returned this weekend from a couple of weeks in Europe and the last week in Germany, where the annual meeting of the FIBV, the Organization of International Stock Exchanges, the heads of the exchanges, met in a bifurcated meeting in Frankfurt and then in Berlin. And so I still have a little jet lag. It's not like flying Air Force One, but it's been a most interesting couple of weeks in Europe. Somebody asked me, why did I take this job? When I left Congress in January of '87, I was practicing law as a partner here in a Washington law firm, had business interests in Oklahoma and affiliated with a law firm there. Had a very good time of life, having a good time, and then this came along. And I guess it was irresistible to me, because the securities industry it was my sense that it was undergoing a tremendous change, one of those sea changes that take place that present tremendous opportunities and also tremendous risks for anyone who gets involved in that particular arena. And I think that's what made it irresistible to me. And everything that I've learned in the past 10 or 11 months since I've been at the American Stock Exchange reinforces that sense of change that is occurring. As I see it in the securities industry, just in the time since I've come to Washington in 1961, there have been a couple of major events or changes that have changed the number of the players involved in the securities industry. They've been partly because of private sector development, partly because of government or public policy, but the combination of the two have changed both the way business is done and the order of power structure within the business. In the 1960s, promulgated to a large extent by government policy with the NASA space program, but technology advances were beginning to take off. And in the 1970s, we saw the fruit of the technology investments that were made in the 1960s, coupled with some change in public policy, namely the partial deregulation of the securities business, taking away such things as fixed commissions, etc. And that developed some different players or changed the scenario. For example, in the marketplace itself, in the past, in the deregulation days, when things were done mostly by pieces of paper, when you went public, if you were a company going public, you immediately went to the over-the-counter market, and when you grew up large enough, you went to the American Stock Exchange, and when you grew still larger, you just evolved into the New York Stock Exchange. Well, in the days of deregulation and new technology, that over-the-counter market sort of leapt ahead and became a very powerful exchange or marketplace, if you will. And it put the American Stock Exchange, the New York Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ in direct competition. And there have been winners and losers, and that game still is not over. In the 1980s, we saw a continuation of the advances in technology, especially in the field of telecommunications. and having spent this time last year in Poland advising the new Polish government, and then last week in East Berlin talking to people there, one of the things that is apparent to me that one of the driving forces of the tremendous revolution that has taken place in Central and Eastern Europe was the advance in telecommunications, the inability to keep the rest of the world from penetrating that closed society. And once they saw what was on the other side, the demand to change was there. So in the 1980s, we saw further technological advances, and we also saw, because of that, a thinking in global terms. And in the area of finance especially, national borders became less and less important. And I think they're going to be even less important as we get into the 1990s. And so the 1980s, in my judgment, have set the stage for another major development in the 1990s, and that is the globalization. And any way you look at it, in my judgment, the 1990s market picture will be painted on a global canvas. As I see it, we'll probably have a three-tier market, with one tier being the global stocks, those 200 to 500 companies that are of worldwide renown, that will be traded in all parts of the globe at any time of the day or night, wherever you are, 24 hours a day. You'll have basically an international market, which will not be simultaneous 24-hour trading, but will be companies whose stocks will be traded somewhat around the globe, because those are the companies that are going to be involved in the export of their goods and services, or in joint ventures to produce their goods and services in other lands than their national origin. And they will want, along with the exposure of their products, they will also want exposure to the financial community in the countries in which they do business. They perhaps will not be globally known, but they will be known in different parts of the world and will be traded in different parts of the world beyond just the hours of trading in their own home countries. And then the third tier of that market will be essentially national stocks, your smaller companies. I think in looking at that global marketplace, we as a country need to keep our eye on the developments that are happening overseas, and the most significant of those is in Europe and what is happening in Europe 1992. What seems to be happening is as they try to rationalize 12 different securities laws and 12 different systems of trading securities, what seems to be happening is that they will have sort of a base of public protection, if you will, somewhat of a floor or a safety net of protection to the public, beyond which they're not going to try to rationalize their various differences, but they will essentially give national treatment so that what one country is allowed to do under its system will be recognized in another country. I think that portends some important lessons for the United States, and that is that we too are going to have to look at the possibility of liberalizing our own securities laws in order to compete in what will be a much different world in 1993, primarily because of what is happening in Europe. When you add to that what is happening in the emerging markets around the world, I think that we're going to have to have our securities laws changed in many respects in order to be a global competitor. If you look what's happening in Eastern Europe, it truly is amazing to see the desire to put a free market system into place. Again, as I say, last year at this time, when I was in Warsaw, on this group that was advising the Polish government, in front of the Polish Parliament, the same, there was a demonstration. And most of these, mostly young people, looked like some of our retreads from the 1960s the hippie movement and those who protested in the 1960s in this country. And we stopped and talked to some of them and tried to find out what it was that they were protesting or demonstrating against. And what it was is they wanted to move more quickly to a free market system, which I found quite ironic in Poland, and it would have been quite ironic in the United States for that matter. But what is happening in Eastern Europe is quite interesting. Just in the time that I've been at the American Stock Exchange, I've been visited by various sets of public officials from these countries, one of whom was a woman from Lithuania who at the time was, I think, in their parliament and was wanting to establish a market system there. She's now the Prime Minister of Lithuania. They had one problem in trying to develop their own monetary system. The Soviets had confiscated their entire national treasury of rubles, and so they had a very difficult time developing a monetary system. But we've had visits from Czechoslovakia, from Yugoslavia, from Dr. Ilona Hardy, who runs the Budapest Stock Exchange, from Poland, and the message is all the same. They want to get into a free market system. They want to develop a liquid marketplace, and in Hungary they're doing it. I believe just recently, while they started out in June with the reopening of the Budapest Stock Exchange, that started out trading debt securities. They're now into their first equity security, as I understand it, and things are moving along well there. Well, now, if we're going to be painting this marketplace on a global canvas in the 1990s, what does that mean for the United States, and what are some of the things that are likely to happen? Well, I think one of the things that's likely to happen is that there will be more consolidations. For example, in the markets themselves, I would be very surprised to see more than 3 significant marketplaces survive in the 1990s, at least 2 of which will be an auction-based market with taking on increasing electronic trading capability, and then one, of course, being essentially an electronic marketplace, taking on the respectability, the responsibilities of the auction market to keep a continuous quality market going. So I do think that there is going to be more consolidations in the marketplace. I think there will be more consolidations among the securities firms themselves. Secondly, I think that we will be seeing, as I say, a move toward more liberalization of our own securities laws. I think there has to be, and we have to as a country, maintain a public policy status, that there is a floor, there is a safety net of protection for the public, because I think to maintain or to rebuild a sense of confidence in the marketplace is absolutely essential for any marketplace to be successful. And as a matter of fact, in all of these emerging markets, representatives who come to New York and have visited with me over the past 11 months, that is the first thing that I tell them that they need to have is credibility in the marketplace. And the one piece of assistance that we can give at the American Stock Exchange is the kind of apparatus we have that detects irregularities in the marketplace, that detects those kinds of events that unfairly prejudice that individual investor or that smaller investor vis-a-vis the professional larger investor. And so while we have to have that basic sense of protection for the public, I think we're also going to have to revisit our own securities laws and ask whether we are going to continue to make them so rigid that we will not be competitive in a world marketplace. For example, at the present time, it is very difficult for many companies in foreign countries to register and to have their stocks traded here in the United States marketplace or raise capital here in a public marketplace. Difficult for a couple of reasons. Number one, is our reporting requirements are substantially more stringent than in many countries. Prime example of this is the United States versus Germany, where an entirely different system of reporting requirements exist in Germany, where the banks themselves have a much more dominant role in the whole securities area than they do in this country. And as a result, there is a certain wall beyond which the banks will not give out information about investors or about companies in Germany, whereas much more reporting is required in this country. Secondly, the accounting systems and requirements are different, and that has been an impediment to listing and registering stocks in this country. So I think that our own Congress and the SEC have got to look at our securities laws and determine where we liberalize and perhaps mirror what is happening in Europe 92 if we're going to maintain competitiveness. I think there are side issues that are now pending before the Congress that have to be resolved. For example, this whole dispute between the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Commodities Future Trading Commission on who has jurisdiction over these hybrid derivative products that are derived essentially from securities. And I think we're certainly the only industrial country in the world that bifurcates the jurisdiction over securities, giving part of it to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the other part in the stock index futures, for example, or index participations, giving that jurisdiction to the Commodities Future Trading Commission. Having been a first-term member of Congress in 1973-74, when the Commodities Futures Trading Commission was established, and having voted for that, having come from a rural state, I can tell you that the intent of this member of Congress was not to ever have the CFTC in jurisdiction over a product that came from a securities. The whole purpose of the CFTC was to establish a regulatory framework to regulate commodities, basically agricultural commodities, but commodities, in the same fashion that the Securities and Exchange Commission regulated securities, equity securities. And it seems to make no sense to me to continue this kind of bifurcated jurisdiction. And as a practical matter, as long as it continues, some innovative products that we have innovated here in the United States are not being traded and will not be traded and will not be exposed to investors in U.S. markets until this jurisdiction question is solved. And incidentally, those same products or similar products are being traded in Toronto and will be traded in London. So that jurisdiction question, that's something that's going to have to be dealt with. Also in the taxing issues, I think since the budget talks are underway right now, it's important to put in context what we do and we don't tax. There's no question that if there's a revenue component, that all segments of the society are going to have to participate and to pay some of the cost of new taxes. It's only fair, it's the only politically feasible thing to do. And what concerns me is instead of being straightforward about this and saying, okay, let's tax the wealthier by increasing the rates or putting a surtax on or something like that, let's do it indirectly in a way that perhaps will not be noticed and tax the wealthy that way. And they're talking about a securities transfer tax, excise tax. Well, that may make some sense initially in the budget negotiations, but as a practical matter, we're already living in a global marketplace, and we are already competitive in a global marketplace. And if we start putting taxes like this on that make us non-competitive, we will see business leave. I think there's no question about that, and the latest CRS study confirms that. It was confirmed again last week at this meeting of the international stock exchanges in Germany. One example, the options market, the OM out of Sweden. It's a very innovative private, it's actually a private company that's traded on another stock exchange in Europe. It's a very innovative options market and started in Stockholm. And Sweden had a similar securities transfer tax, and they just left because all the business was leaving, and they went to London, where a foreign stock exchange is not taxed on the securities transfer tax. And as a result of that, Sweden is repealing its securities transfer tax in order to be competitive, because they saw so much business leaving Stockholm and going elsewhere. Of the roughly 10 countries that have a stock securities transfer excise tax, I think 5 of them are either in the process of substantially reducing or totally repealing it, and the move is in the other direction. So if in this country we were to put on a securities transfer tax, I think it would definitely make us non-competitive in a global marketplace, and we would see more business leave. Also, I think in the next 2 or 3 years, we're going to have to revisit the whole issue of financial structure in this country. Things such as Glass-Steagall and other issues like that are going to have to be addressed. I saw a table on an airplane. I sound a little like Ronald Reagan reading Reader's Digest, but I don't remember the issue. But it was on an airplane. It was a table of the 25 largest financial institutions in the world. Not banks, but financial institutions. And of those 25, the United States had only one place on that list, and it was the Resolution Trust Corporation, which was not exactly what we would be proudest to have on that list. I think we're going to probably see, and Congress and the administration will have to address in the next 2 to 3 years, legislation that deals with our whole financial structure in this country. And if and when they do that, I think that will bring new players into the game of the securities industry. Clearly some banks, very potentially some communications companies, but new capital will come into the securities business, which I think will make us, again, more competitive. One of the things that has concerned me is that we make it difficult for individual investors to play the market, so to speak. It's not difficult and it's not uncomfortable if you're, as they say, Joe's six-pack, and you have a few $1,000s that you want to invest, to go to your bank to buy a money market fund or a CD or something like that. You feel comfortable. You don't necessarily feel comfortable going into a brokerage office and buying an individual stock. I think the American Stock Exchange is the only marketplace where the majority of our investors are still the individual retail investors. Whereas it used to be 70-some% individual, it's now down to 55% individual versus 45% institutional. The New York Stock Exchange used to be 70-30 individual. It's now 28-72 institutional. 72% of those are institutional traders. So I do believe that we need to find a way to regain the individual investor to invest in corporate America, to invest in the equities of this country. I think it helps strengthen a free market system. I think from management's point of view, they ought to be interested in having a broad array of individual ownership. But I think that's going to have to be done. We're going to have to make the individual investor more comfortable that they have a fair shake, that it's easy to get in, it's easy to get out. And I think in this whole financial restructuring, there may come from that easier ways in which we can invest as individuals through our home computer, PC, through the banks, through different kinds of institutions. But that's something the United States, I think, needs to look at and find out how can we make it more comfortable for the individual investor. The final thing I want to mention, well, I also will backtrack just a minute to underscore what I'm talking about on the globalization and some of the changes that I think we're going to have to make over the next 2 or 3 years. 2 organizations are now becoming, were sort of social organizations. They're now becoming working organizations, one of which is the FIBB, which was established 30 years ago, but this is the first time that they're really doing something meaty. And they're going to do more in the future as John Phelan leaves the New York Exchange and January 1 becomes president of the FIBB, which is the International Stock Exchanges. But what they're talking about is more of a framework for self-regulatory organizations, and to really make self-regulation mean something not only in the United States but around the world, to reestablish a sense of credibility, of fairness, of security in the securities markets around the country. I also sensed from the meeting last week that the recognition of globalization is such that there will be a lot of joint ventures coming out of these organizations, an organization like this, so that there will be a worldwide network of stock exchanges that will perhaps pass the book from one time zone to another. Clearly, that's the direction we're looking at the American Stock Exchange. The second organization is IOSCO, which is an organization primarily of the regulators, not of the private marketplaces, but of the regulators in these countries. And the regulators themselves are now beginning to do some meaningful things in terms of establishing a framework where the laws will be such that they can give sort of national treatment to each other's securities laws. So all of those things combined lead me to believe that we are going to be operating in the 1990s truly in a global marketplace. That in order to compete, we have to update our own laws, and we have to improve our own economy, and that's the last thing that I'd like to mention, and that is the budget itself and the negotiations that are going on. While I started out saying that you can pick up where you left off 10 years ago or 5 years ago or whatever, and that the speeches are the same and the issues are the same, that is true. But the importance is also as important as I said it was 5 years ago. And that is this whole, as long as this budget deficit problem remains unattended, we are doing, as Charlie Schultz says, allowing the termites in the basement to eat the foundation of the house. And over time, it could bring the house down. It won't necessarily be dramatic, but over time, it will make us non-competitive. Initially, it makes us less and less in control of our own destiny, because we see now, in one instance after another, that the more foreign ownership of our debt and the more dependence we have on foreign sources here. In Poland, advising the new Polish government, and then last week in East Berlin, talking to people there, one of the things that is apparent to me that one of the driving forces of the tremendous revolution that has taken place in Central and Eastern Europe was the advance in telecommunications, the inability to keep the rest of the world from penetrating that closed society. And once they saw what was on the other side, the demand to change was there. So in the 1980s, we saw further technological advances, and we also saw, because of that, a thinking in global terms. And in the area of finance especially, national borders became less and less important. And I think they're going to be even less important as we get into the 1990s. And so the 1980s, in my judgment, have set the stage for another major development in the 1990s, and that is the globalization. And any way you look at it, in my judgment, the 1990s market picture will be painted on a global canvas. As I see it, we'll probably have a three-tier market, with one tier being the global stock. Some percent individual is now down to 55% individual versus 45% institutional. The New York Stock Exchange used to be 70-30 individual. It's now 28-72 institutional. 72% of those are institutional traders. So I do believe that we need to find a way to regain the individual investor to invest in corporate America, to invest in the equities of this country. I think it helps strengthen a free market system. I think from management's point of view, they ought to be interested in having a broad array of individual ownership. But I think that's going to have to be done. We're going to have to make the individual investor more comfortable that they have a fair shake, that it's easy to get in, it's easy to get out. And I think in this whole financial restructuring, there may come from that easier ways in which we can invest as individuals through our home computer, PC, through the banks, through different kinds of institutions. But that's something the United States, I think, needs to look at and find out how can we make it more comfortable for the individual investor. The final thing I want to mention, well, I also will backtrack just a minute to underscore what I'm talking about on the globalization and some of the changes that I think we're going to have to make over the next 2 or 3 years. 2 organizations, and having spent this time last year in Poland advising the new Polish government, and then last week in East Berlin talking to people there, one of the things that is apparent to me that one of the driving forces of the tremendous revolution that has taken place in Central and Eastern Europe was the advance in telecommunications, the inability to keep the rest of the world from penetrating that closed society. And once they saw what was on the other side, the demand to change was there. So in the 1980s, we saw further technological advances, and we also saw, because of that, a thinking in global terms. And in the area of finance especially, national borders became less and less important. And I think they're going to be even less important as we get into the 1990s. And so the 1980s, in my judgment, have set the stage for another major development in the 1990s, and that is the globalization. And any way you look at it, in my judgment, the 1990s market picture will be painted on a global canvas. As I see it, we'll probably have a 3-tier market with 1 tier uncompetitive in a global marketplace, and we would see more business leave. Also, I think in the next 2 or 3 years, we're going to have to revisit the whole issue of financial structure in this country. Things such as Glass-Steagall and other issues like that are going to have to be addressed. I saw a table on an airplane. I sound a little like Ronald Reagan reading Reader's Digest, but I don't remember the issue. But it was on an airplane. It was a table of the 25 largest financial institutions in the world. Not banks, but financial institutions. And of those 25, the United States had only 1 place on that list, and it was the Resolution Trust Corporation, which was not exactly what we would be proudest to have on that list. I think we're going to probably see, and Congress and the administration will have to address in the next 2 to 3 years, legislation that deals with our whole financial structure in this country. And if and when they do that, I think that will bring new players into the game of the securities industry. Clearly some banks, very potentially some communications companies, but new capital will come into the securities business, which I think will make us, again, more competitive. One of the things that has concerned me is that change that is occurring. As I see it in the securities industry, just in the time since I've come to Washington in 1961, there have been a couple of major events or changes that have changed the players involved in the securities industry. They've been partly because of private sector development, partly because of government or public policy, but the combination of the two have changed both the way business is done and the order of power structure within the business. In the 1960s, promulgated to a large extent by government policy with the NASA space program, but technology advances were beginning to take off. And in the 1970s, we saw the fruit of the technology investments that were made in the 1960s, coupled with some change in public policy, namely the partial deregulation of the securities business, taking away such things as fixed commissions, etc. And that develop some different players or change the scenario. For example, in the marketplace itself, in the past, in the deregulation days, when things were done mostly by pieces of paper in Poland, and it would have been quite ironic in the United States for that matter. But what is happening in Eastern Europe is quite interesting. Just in the time that I've been at the American Stock Exchange, I've been visited by various sets of public officials from these countries, one of whom was a woman from Lithuania who at the time was, I think, in their parliament and was wanting to establish a market system there. She's now the Prime Minister of Lithuania. They had one problem in trying to develop their own monetary system. The Soviets had confiscated their entire national treasury of rubles, and so they had a very difficult time developing a monetary system. But we've had visits from Czechoslovakia, from Yugoslavia, from Dr. Ilona Hardy, who runs the Budapest Stock Exchange, from Poland, and the message is all the same. They want to get into a free market system. They want to develop a liquid marketplace, and in Hungary they're doing it. I believe just recently, while they started out in June with the reopening of the Budapest Stock Exchange, that started out trading debt securities, they're now into their first equity security, as I understand. Remember the issue, but it was on an airplane. It was a table of the 25 largest financial institutions in the world, not banks, but financial institutions. And of those 25, the United States had only one place on that list, and it was the Resolution Trust Corporation, which was not exactly what we would be proudest to have on that list. I think we're going to probably see, and Congress and the administration will have to address in the next 2 to 3 years, legislation that deals with our whole financial structure in this country. And if and when they do that, I think that will bring new players into the game of the securities industry. Clearly some banks, very potentially some communications companies, but new capital will come into the securities business, which I think will make us, again, more competitive. One of the things that has concerned me is that we make it difficult for individual investors to play the market, so to speak. It's not difficult and it's not uncomfortable if you're, as they say, Joe's six-pack, and you have a few $1,000s that you want to invest, to go to your bank to buy a money market fund or a CD or something like that. You feel comfortable. You don't. Various sets of public officials from these countries, one of whom was a woman from Lithuania who at the time was, I think, in their parliament and was wanting to establish a market system there. She's now the Prime Minister of Lithuania. They had one problem in trying to develop their own monetary system. The Soviets had confiscated their entire national treasury of rubles, and so they had a very difficult time developing a monetary system. But we've had visits from Czechoslovakia, from Yugoslavia, from Dr. Ilona Hardy, who runs the Budapest Stock Exchange, from Poland, and the message is all the same. They want to get into a free market system. They want to develop a liquid marketplace, and in Hungary they're doing it. I believe just recently, while they started out in June with the reopening of the Budapest Stock Exchange, that started out trading debt securities, they're now into their first equity security, as I understand it, and things are moving along well there. Well, now, if we're going to be painting this marketplace on a global canvas in the 1990s, what does that mean for the United States, and what are some of the things